Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about bicep training versus lat training. Because again, some guys out here do care about their biceps, and we could make the argument that bicep training and bicep development does help with your bench press, right? We could argue that it also makes your biceps more resilient to tears on deadlift if you do mixed grip. So there are reasons outside of just wanting bigger arms to make sure that you have some bicep development. But let's be realistic. Most younger guys out there, particularly, they care a lot about their arms, right? Whether they're training purely for strength or not. A lot do. So we need to address that from a volume perspective. Because again, what is it we generally are looking at? We're trying to get 10 to 20 quality sets per week. 10 to 20 quality sets. But we have to determine if an exercise actually counts as a full set or not for a muscle group, when determining what we need to do. So a lot of that comes down to looking at muscle activation, biomechanics, things like that, when looking at the different forms of pulling. Because vertical versus horizontal pulling does not elicit the same amount of bicep activation. And a lot of people will say, well, you can do underhand grip. Even then, a supine grip on rowing exercises doesn't actually give you that good of bicep recruitment, even with a supine grip. And if anything, in some cases, you're actually risking bicep tears. So it's just something to think about there. Here's the couple of studies that we do have that we could look at, and the studies all actually seem to translate over to each other well, right? They translate over really well when we look at hypertrophy studies versus EMG on this particular topic, and when you look at anecdote in the real world. Because usually in the real world, you find that guys who are really good at chin-ups, for example, tend to have pretty good biceps. Guys who only do rows and no curls oftentimes just don't have as big a biceps. They'll get bicep development. They do a ton of rowing. But they're not usually as big. Right? They're usually not as big. That's the anecdote in the real world. What about the studies? And then what do we do about it on the training side? Okay, you look at studies that have compared hypertrophy and horizontal versus vertical pulling. What do they find? Well, if you look at any of the lat pull down studies, what they found is that lat pull downs compared to curls produce just as much muscle growth, right? We can carry that over to all vertical pulling, chin-ups, pull-ups, things like that. But lat pull downs in studies produce just as much muscle growth as curls. Now, four people say, well, we could just do all vertical pulling then, right? And we'd get the best of both worlds. No, because then your upper back is going to suck. Right, vertical pulling builds your lats, doesn't build the rest of your back. Not very effectively. It comes back over to not being as good. Still hits a lot of it. It's not as good. So they produce the same. And in at least novice lifters who did lat pull downs, when they compared them to novice lifters who included curls with lat pull downs, what do they find? No extra bicep growth. None. But what happens when you compare it to horizontal pulling, rowing? There's been one study that compared that, and you know what they found? Guess what? It's one of Schoenfeld's studies, and I don't always like everything he does, but data is data. Found that 6 sets of curls a week produced more bicep growth than 6 sets of dumbbell rows per week. It just did. Now, the dumbbell rows still made biceps grow. We do want to make that point clear. There was growth. It just wasn't as much as curls did. What about EMG studies? Well, those are pretty consistent. Vertical pulling, whether it's pull-ups, chin-ups, produces a very, very good bicep activation. Just as good as most types of curls. In fact, even overhand grip, pronated pull-ups produce just as much bicep activation as some types of curls that were not as effective. Right? And when we go to neutral grip or underhand grip, which would then be a chin-up, they produce just as much muscle activation on an EMG as the best curls. Arguably, then they're just as good. What about rowing? Rowing in general produced less bicep activation on EMGs. All right, in this case, because I always tell people EMG data can't be taken by itself because it can be misleading if you use it as the only tool available. It's not known for being the best tool. But in this case, the EMG data backs the actual hypertrophy data. They seem to match. So we have two different sources that seem to give similar data when we look at the bulk of the studies. And it seems to match what we see in the real world. Guys who do a lot of rows and no curls don't usually have that big of biceps relative to other lifters. Okay. People who do a lot of vertical pulling, chin-ups, pull-ups, things like that, tend to build pretty big biceps from it. So what does this mean for lifters who want to focus on rows? Well, this means that if you're doing a lot of chins or neutral grip pull-ups, you don't need as much curling, right? They count as full work sets. So let's come back over and look at it from that perspective. Let's say you're trying to be in that range, and let's say that you are doing 5 sets or 6 sets of vertical pulling twice a week. Well, you probably only need at most 1 bicep exercise, if any, right? Because if you're doing like 6 sets, well, that's 12 sets for your biceps if you do it twice a week, because I promote upper lower training like most good coaches do. 4-day-a-week upper lower. Well, you're in that range, aren't you? You could do some extra bicep work if you feel biceps are a weak link, right? Wouldn't be a bad idea. But you probably don't need more than about 3 sets. Because then we're up here at that point of doing about 9 sets for biceps a workout, 18 sets a week. We're on the upper end of that 10 to 20 range, aren't we? Yep. What about when we're doing rows instead? Let's say you're not doing all this. Let's say you're focusing heavily on rows like I do in some phases or some of my lifters do, because we need all that upper back development and other stuff. So we're not doing chin-ups and pull-ups. They're at best half sets. So even if you're doing 6 sets of row type exercises twice a week, it's really only about 3 sets for biceps. It really is. In that case, you might need 2 different bicep exercises. Which is what you see me doing in this video, right? Standing curls and incline curls. And I mean true bicep exercises, not telling you to do a bunch of hammer curls and stuff at this point. I mean direct bicep exercises with a supine grip that we know hits the most bicep. It would behoove you to do that. You might want to do more, because in that case, let's look at it. We're only getting about 3 sets. Doing 2 different exercises for about 3 sets each to get 6 more sets per workout takes us up to about 9 sets for biceps per workout. Just using this as an example, which translates to what? About 18 sets a week. We're towards the upper end of that range. If you're someone who cares about biceps quite a bit, you feel like they're a weak link, being towards the upper end of that range for those muscles is a good idea, such as me in these videos. Who knows where I'll be by the time this video comes out, but at the time this footage was made. So that's how you should probably look at it. In other words, for your training volume, rowing should count as half sets, pull-ups and chin-ups should count as full sets for biceps. That's how I would count it. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.